which wisdom's not the same as knowledge. You know, wisdom is explaining how we fit into the whole of things. And so that's where I think people are turning backward, because there are some topics for which you'll find a lot more in Plato in terms of what's helpful than you'll find in any textbook, from one of the science departments of today. Freedom is about having as many options as possible and choosing the one that I like best. That's a very modern notion of freedom and selfhood. There's another notion of freedom, an older one, that would say that, freedom's not choosing what you want, it's becoming what you truly are. If you look at a plant, that plant is free when it's in the conditions that it can actually grow and flourish. And if it's meant to have flowers, flower. So the greatest thing you can do to benefit the future, raise a child, invest in them, teach them. I don't know why, but I think the assumption of most people is that if there's a God, it should be the most obvious fact in the world, or it should be the most accessible experience of the world.
Hello and welcome to WS Podcast. My name is Wojciech, of course, and welcome to the stage, Mr. Joe Barnard. Hello.
It's great to be with you.
Thank you for coming. So for you guys, just as maybe a bit of context, Joe is a minister at a local Edinburgh church, Holyrood.
That's right, yeah.
Holyrood Evangelical, how do you say the full name?
Yeah, sometimes we call it Holyrood Church, but there is an evangelical in the middle. So, Holyrood Evangelical Church.
And that is the church to which my friend Aaron, who was already on the podcast and will be again, attends with his wife and I assume with their child. And so Aaron just suggested, I was gifted one of Joe's books, which I'll explore in our next season on spirituality. There are many other books that Joe has written, and Aaron just gave this book to me as a gift. He wrote in the dedication that I like a good challenge, so here it is. And for Aaron, this book, from what he told me, was really transformative in a sense. It seems like it invigorated his pursuit of faith. And he showed me his beautiful Bible, with which he's studying diligently every day. And then he suggested that maybe it would be worthy to have a conversation with you. So with that introduction, I guess, could you briefly introduce yourself to our listeners and also maybe reflect why do you think, is that what you tried to achieve with the book?
Yeah, so we're in Edinburgh right now. I don't have an Edinburgh accent. Scotland's not my original home. I'm from the United States, but most of my working life has been in Scotland. I was up in the Highlands for about 10 years, been 5 years in Edinburgh. But home is New Orleans, that area in the southern United States. So grew up there, but really over the last 10 years have had a more and more of a focus in terms of men's ministry, men's needs, trying to help guys find friendship, get healthy disciplines, all connected with a pursuit of God as well. So this book, The Road Back to God, really is an attempt to try to help guys who are maybe thinking about spiritual things or listening into conversations, maybe not from a church background, but to give them a little bit of a path in terms of what a journey toward faith might look like.
Sure, and if anything, I personally, I believe you've done it. I enjoyed the book. In a second, I'll share some of the quotes, and maybe these might be conversation starters, let's say.
Yeah.
But in terms of the idea behind it and the timeliness of it, personally, I would give you a 10 out of 10. It certainly feels to me as I think they call us not the millennials, but Gen X, I guess, because Z is the new... Yeah, so I'm somewhere in the middle of that.
You look Gen Z, I'll give you Gen Z.
I look young, but I'm that young, but thank you so much, that's a compliment. So I certainly feel, and this reverberated from my life and experience as well, that there seems to have been a loss and a revival of at least a need for moral guidance, maybe that's a good way to put it, among young people. And whether that's necessarily among men only, I don't know. I assume to some degree it feels like men are more lost these days than women, but of course that's a generalization, each to their own. But for me, especially after the uni time, after I've sort of started realizing that the world and life is bigger than it seems to begin with, searching for those truths, those ideas, those moral paths has definitely been like a revival. I would call it a revival, literally, to the point that I would divide my life so far, I'm almost 30, into three sections. One was like childhood, where you're completely running on autopilot and you're not the one steering the wheel. Then I had the adolescence, where I was running on autopilot, but I was steering the wheel, just unknowingly. And now the autopilot is turned off and I am at the wheel. And at this point, you either get really lost or you get lost to the point that you want to find something. And I think that's the target audience that you're aiming for there.
I think that's right. I think, we've kind of been born into a culture where the world around us has been disenchanted. A lot of us have been taught exclusively kind of a scientific framework of things that is very reductionistic. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a kind of aridness, a dryness, an absence of something that people have grown up with, combined with a sense of despair. I think for a long time, people could survive in that because they had a sense of hopefulness, because they felt like the world was getting better. So you could leave religion, you could leave spirituality behind you because we were going to replace it with something better. When you take hope away and you take a sense of existential meaning and enchantment away, all of a sudden you're left in an environment that does not meet the needs, the appetites of the soul. And so I think you've got a whole generation of people right now with these appetites and not quite sure how to satisfy them. But instead of looking forward, they're beginning to look backward. Instead of just looking around them in the kind of consumeristic world, they're looking upward. And so, I think it's an interesting time in terms of reflecting on philosophical questions, spiritual questions, because people are more interested than they were a generation or two ago.
Yeah, and what would you say then? Because you just said about looking back. Do you mean in search of maybe traditions to lean back upon, or do you mean in terms of like trying to find the truths that were forgotten?
Yeah, I think there are certain voices, there are certain traditions, there are certain conversations that strangely people in the past were better at than we are. So we've increased one kind of knowledge. If it's a kind of knowledge that's analytical, breaking things down, looking at their components, we're better than any other civilization at that kind of scientific inquiry. If it comes to asking questions about, what makes for a healthy community? How do people flourish? What is the end? What is the purpose of a man, a woman? These are questions that we're mute, we're dumb, we don't know how to answer. And so when you go back, you find that whether it's in the sort of Christian tradition, whether it's the Greco-Roman tradition, but there's a moral framework, there are conversations, and you enter into those conversations and you begin to discern something that is almost altogether lacking from the modern world, and it's what would have been called wisdom, which wisdom's not the same as knowledge. Wisdom is explaining how we fit into the whole of things. And so that's where I think people are turning backward, because there are some topics for which you'll find a lot more in Plato in terms of what's helpful than you'll find in any textbook, from one of the science departments of today. And so there's that need to go backward, and we actually do discover wisdom, whether it's the Stoics, again, whether it's the New Testament. If you've only been educated in the modern world, and you pick up for the first time, whether it's the Apostle Paul or it's Seneca, you have the sense that there's meat, there's substance, there's protein, there's something that's nourishing here that I've not had before. And so I think that's part of this sort of journey backwards.
And, you just made me think about, personally, I do believe that we always believe in something.
Yeah.
It's just a human, a feature. of our existence, that there is always a belief, whether it's a belief in that it's going to be better, whether it's belief in God, whether it's belief in a community, in science. And something that I did consider and I discussed with my parents when I was younger was this idea: isn't science in some ways replacing religion? And isn't that to some degree, of course, useful because we know more about the physical world, let's say. But at the same time, as you said, it's almost degrading, or at least closing the doors to the others. And we end up with many pieces of puzzle and no idea whatsoever what the frame is to put them in.
I think that's right. There's the inability to look at what might have been called the form. And so people talk about, to dissect something, you have to kill it. So, the scientist is taking things apart, but in doing so, they're missing the possibility that there's something about the total form that's there for a purpose and even revelatory. So you can look up at a cloud, and you can say, well, in one sense, we could talk about the moisture and the atmospheric conditions that go into the composition of a cloud. But then you could have a poet that looks up at the cloud and says, that looks like the throne of a god to me. Maybe the cloud is meant to reveal something of what the Bible would call kavod, or glory, to us. And those are not mutually exclusive, but what we've done is acted as if it's only the scientist that has access to truth or knowledge or reality, which is an arrogant assumption, because it's assuming that all information or all knowledge can come through our senses, and we've only got a few of them in our intellect, and that's pretty puny. Well, what if there's actually something transcendent and something that communicates with us in a different way? And there's a whole lot of tradition, there's a whole lot of civilizations that they might have different conceptions of it, but they're all telling us that there is transcendence, and that only the fool would act as if all knowledge is accessible to sight, taste, touch, hearing, etc. So I think we need to recover that sense of transcendence as being something, not that we impose upon reality, but it's a feature of reality itself that has to be appreciated and explored.
Maybe this is not something you've considered or is of interest to you, but I do wonder, why would that be, that over the past, let's say, 70, 100 years of this world we live in, post-World War, why was, you said about the abundance and the hope for the future, but would there potentially be some greater idea of replacing religious rites and faith with science? Is there an end to that transition? Does that, because for me, for example, I felt, considering these things and reading back the great works of different cultures, I felt like in some ways we've just been dumbed down through this lens. Like if all I believe is that what meets the eye, then I have to self-censor whenever I experience whatever doesn't meet it, right? So it's almost like I'm limiting myself because someone told me that those are the limits.
I think that's right. I think, and we can look at multiple factors. I mean, there's an economic element, where what our society is really governed by is the value of making money and productivity and that kind of thing. It's good for our economy for people just to pursue a profession that's focused on achievement and money. You don't need transcendence for that as a distraction. Equally, you've got the scientific side where there's been a kind of arrogance. I mean, I think there's been a hope among, you can go all the way back to someone like Francis Bacon, where there's this sense that we can kind of shake God off our back. We can do away with him. We can assert ourselves. It's a kind of retelling of the Tower of Babel almost, where we can make a name for ourselves. We can access heaven through our own ingenuity. And I think there is kind of an arrogance beneath that kind of narrative that underpins the modern scientific project. So I don't know that we're always completely conscious of it, but I think for a long time there was an optimism. There was a sense maybe we can do all together without religion in all of these things. And that gives us a sense of control. We can manage our own world, we can explain our own world, we can build our own world. But part of that story, the Tower of Babel in the Old Testament, is that they try to build this tower to the sky. It ends up leading to all kinds of confusion. It doesn't work out well for them. And I think what we're finding is we're back in that age of we're confused and we're lost. And actually, some of our technology is now out of control. We don't know how to master it. So we're in that same position we've always been of being small, vulnerable creatures, and maybe in need of, again, wisdom that isn't accessible right now, and we've got to go back and recover it.
And if anything, I do agree, and I would argue that technologically, in particular, there are many voices that are very much so speaking that essentially we've reached the pinnacle, and we can literally just decide, whether we're a man or a woman, whether we want to have to live another 200 years because of all the different altercations that we can do. Maybe for technology we can make ourselves immortal. So I would say the technology here is playing the bricks role of the Tower of Babel, for sure. Now, why do you think, and do you agree, that young men in particular, are falling the biggest victim of it? It is not obvious to me why that happens, but it is obvious to me that looking at the statistics even, just from how women are doing in school versus men, how women are doing in career on the up versus men, and noticing it around my friends who are majorly on the men's side, it seems to me that that's the trend. Like, young men are more lost, and this is not to diminish the lostness of young women. Rather, why do you think, and why did you focus on young men to begin with?
I think young men are really important. I'm not saying more important, but they're just important, and I think men need to hear that right now, because I think a lot of young men aren't quite sure what their value is. So I think they're worth talking to, first of all, and I think it's a really confusing time. On the one side, you've got the breakdown of society and the breakdown of family, most acutely the absence of fathers. So this sort of tribal generational network that would have given guidance to a boy, the sort of rites of passage that would have helped him to know, who am I? Who do I belong to? What stage of life am I in? At what point am I a man? What does it mean to be a man? All of that's been stripped away. And so on the one side, you've got these boys that have no one to mentor them and guide them into mature manhood. On the other side, you've got multiple waves of social revolutions that have happened, that have resulted in, so traditional masculinity is often labeled toxic. Now, certain versions, certain aspects might be, but altogether it's sort of discredited right now. Yeah, sure. Without anything being put in its place. And so what you then just have is you have something that tells men what they shouldn't be and what's evil to be, again, without any sense of, well, what are we supposed to become, other than this sense of like the two, sexes, male and female, just kind of merging into, the sameness. And there's a difference. And so I think, these type things, and then you could put on top of that the sort of sociological trends where, I think you alluded to it, at this point, we're at a point where men are underperforming in school, they're underperforming in the university, underperforming in the workplace. So you've also got this shift where, for the first time, women are now actually filling all of these positions. And so again, men in the workplace, they don't have the same positions that they did. You put all of this together, guys need help. Guys need direction. And so my fear is, if you don't have a good voice to listen to, you fall prey to a bad voice. And there are good voices, but just one other attempt to provide some lifeline to guys that are looking for some advice from an older brother.
Yeah, you just made me think about the idea that, and that's so well put, like, if you strip away what someone is supposed to not be and you give them anything in the place, isn't that reflective of how science announced God dead.
Yeah.
But it left unsaid the question, well, what to put in that place, right? Yeah. The only thing that science, at least from my perspective, offered in its place is chaos, and that's not necessarily the most empowering and comforting of options, right? So would you say, and this is in terms of the family, and I would consider marriage to be a huge part, to be a huge foundation of establishing a society. So if you think about it, and if we talk about sociological sort of sphere, a society is a group of people, right? But without families, that group of people is only going to go one generation, right? Yeah. The cultural trends that I've observed, and whether or not I agree with them, there they are, seem to point in the direction that family is not really needed. It's good to be each for themselves, focus on your career, achieve all those big goals that are being offered to you and advertised as, this car is going to make your life much better. Having hundreds of different women rather than making a worthy relationship with one is going to be better for you because you're such a man. And so there is an outcry of like all these advertisements essentially of what you could make your life to be, while there is a huge diminishing, I think in the majority of Western countries, role of a family unit. As it's easier than ever to get a divorce. If that's so easy, if it's such an easy fix, and this is something that really outrages me. So there is this idea of decision paralysis, right?
Yeah.
If you're offered too many options, you end up being dissatisfied with any.
Yeah.
What I observe in my friends, those ones that are unlucky enough to be still by the age of 30 without a partner, for the most part, because of the apps replacing your day-to-day opportunity to meet someone, whether by peer pressure or just feeling of missing out or maybe dopamine need, you end up using it. Mm-hmm. And what it does over time, it allows you to constantly be rethinking whether or not the person you've chosen is the right one for you.
Yeah.
And then on the extreme case, you have, I have had a friend before who was so active on that app that he could have had like 100 dates within a year. And there was always, whenever he was dating someone, there was always something that was wrong with them. And he would always compare them to someone else. And of course, I could do the same. Like I could compare my relationship with my wife right now to my relationships with some girls from the past. I know that is to the detriment of my relationship with my wife, right? So isn't this maybe like... Why do you think that is the case? Why do you think all those things appeared? Is it something that appeared because people needed it? Or is it something that appeared to just give you another dopamine boost?
Yeah,
and make you lost?
I think, we so readily put our faith in technology and give this space for the people behind it to recreate our lives. And the problem is, you take something like meeting your future spouse, and you can read the sort of cognitive science on this, and what used to happen is there's a sort of algorithm that when you meet someone, you're not even fully conscious of all of the cues. I'm a person of faith, and so I'm finding out is she a person of faith? The kind of vocabulary you use, like what level of education. There's all kinds of things that go into what used to be called clicking. Two people kind of clicking and coming together. Now, I've been married over 21 years, and I can tell you that it took years and years for me to really figure out the things that, in a sense, I wasn't even aware of in my wife, that later on it's like, oh, this is what I so appreciate about her. And I think the problem is the assumption that we can just look and we can sort of scan and instantly assess, and we can see in a picture or whatever, a profile, a person that we want to spend time with, it bypasses the whole embodied, communicative notion of personhood that goes into real relationships. And it does. It makes friendship, and you need friendship for, deeper relationship. It makes friendship a process of consumption. And I think that's one of the most evil things when you begin to treat people like things. That's one of the basis of lust. It's the basis of greed. It's the basis of any number of vices. And it sort of promotes that attitude rather than, plus just the courage. I'm going to actually be in the presence of someone. I'm going to get to know their whole personality. There may be features of them that I find out objectively, I might have thought I'd care about this, but actually they've got this other trait that balances that. And it's worth getting to know them better because of something I wouldn't have seen at first. There's a whole adventure that goes into knowing people that's bypassed with these sort of more technological means. But I think going back to what you said about family, I think it's so vital for men who are lost to begin to realize how important marriage and family really is to their own fulfillment. And I think, things that you can spend, over 10 years in school and go to secondary school and then go to university, and there's certain things they're never going to teach you. And if you're a young man, they're never going to teach you that the fulfillment of being a young man is fatherhood, is marriage. That this is a vital part of, if you plant an acorn, it becomes an oak tree. A boy's supposed to become a husband and a father. And that's not even on the sort of life plan for a lot of guys.
I guess that's because it doesn't really serve the economics on the short term, right? Because, as you said earlier, I believe that education, the way it's structured nowadays, it's preparing you to be a citizen. It's not really preparing you to be a father, a husband, a friend. It's preparing you to be a part of this structure that is, around you the moment you're born, wherever you're born. I would add to those things that are not taught also about faith.
Yeah.
And this is something. It's quite. It's funny is the wrong word. It's quite ironic to ponder because I did have religion as a subject at school, but unfortunately, maybe mostly because of funding, maybe mostly because of who it is to say what was first, the funding or the will, or the funding or the will. But my religious learning at school was the least empowering and the most oppressive. It was simply very similar to learning maths.
Yeah.
There were answers, there were questions, but the questions were there only for you to remember the answer. There was no discussion. There was no asking questions that are, challenging maybe for the religious teacher or for the minister for the priest at church. And this is maybe something that I wanted to ask you about your style. It seems to me that to at least be for religion to become attractive for the modern mind, once someone is looking, I would argue that one has to have a conversation rather than, a monologue. It seems to me that my personal experience in Roman Catholic Church as a young boy was so focused on just doing what I'm told that right after I was finally free from it, for 5 or 6 years, I was completely adamant that there is nothing there to look for. I did all I could to ascertain that I'm free from this oppression that I was put into. And I was the eldest in the family, which also sort of put me in this situation where it was always me and my father that would go to the church because I'm supposed to go to the church, because that's what the eldest does, My sister had it a bit more lenient, my brother was too small, my mom was kind of like, maybe I'll go, maybe I'm not. But I was always made, even if it was of my own making over time, I was made guilty if I didn't. So I was always there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it seems to me, and how does it look in your church as well? It seems to me that for myself, I find it very attractive when I can actually have a conversation about these things, rather than simply listen to someone telling me how to live. And we can get into that in a second, because I know that in evangelical church, you're allowed to be married.
Yeah, that's right.
Which I think, for me, played a huge role in Roman Catholic of undermining any sort of authority of that gentleman. Because essentially, what I saw as a young boy was, there is a man who had never had a woman, who had never had a child, who had never had a wife, who, from my perspective, does not live a life as any other person in this congregation, and yet he's telling me how to be, good as a boyfriend, how to be good as a husband. They're teaching you about raising a family. How does a person who doesn't raise a family can have a comprehension of it? Like, it just sounds untrue to me.
Yeah, I mean, I like to start. I think what's easy, it's kind of downhill for us in the 21st century, is to begin with placing the blame on organized religion, which often feels oppressive to us. I think we're all infected by a sort of virus that we're unaware of. And it's a notion of selfhood. It's the idea that we're all free creatures that should get to independently choose for ourselves, and that freedom is about having as many options as possible and choosing the one that I like best. That's a very modern notion of freedom and selfhood. There's another notion of freedom, an older one, that would say that freedom's not choosing what you want, it's becoming what you truly are. If you look at a plant, that plant is free when it's in the conditions that it can actually grow and flourish. And if it's meant to have flowers, flower. I think when you put a modern person that really wants freedom, in our sense of freedom, in something as old as like the Roman Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church isn't going to provide the kind of freedom that everything in pop music and everything in our media is telling us that we should have. And so often I think there's a real tension. But I think probably both sides need to learn something, but one aspect of it is us growing out of that false sense of freedom and actually thinking deeply about what's going on in religion, because it's talking about hierarchy. You begin with the assumption that there's a God. If there's a God, then I'm under him, and I probably need his help to figure out what's going to enable me to flourish and be strong and fruitful and become who I really am. I'm probably going to have to be attuned to traditions. There's probably an accumulated wisdom that I may not figure out by the time I'm 13, which is when most people leave the church. Yeah. I got to stick around a little bit longer. So I think religion can be difficult for modern people because we want instant pleasure. We think happiness is reducible to sort of the most basic pleasures of the flesh. All of this makes sitting through a church service, with long prayers and reading texts that were written 3,000 years ago. Let's be honest, it can be boring. It can feel inauthentic. But you have to sometimes grow up and mature in order to get a taste for good things. And I think one of those things is religion itself. And whether it's, I grew up in a Roman Catholic area, lots of friends. I went to Catholic schools, know that very well. I'm an evangelical. But in both cases, I think you find you've got to be patient to develop the taste. If you've only ever drank Coca-Cola your whole life, and someone wants to give you a nice single malt whiskey, you're not going to like it at first. Bear with the process over time. You'll stop drinking Coca-Cola and realize the whiskey's much better. But you have to have that kind of education to really comfortably begin to grow up within a faith tradition.
I really like how you put the taste and maturing to the taste. So how could you tell us a little bit? Could you tell me a little bit about the differences, and maybe not a sales pitch, but in a sense, what makes evangelical church different from, for example, a Roman Catholic?
Yeah, maybe the best way. So if you take the word disenchantment, okay? And if you cut it down, you get enchantment. If you take the word enchantment and you cut it down, you get the word chant, which is the sense of something being sung. So I think whether you're Roman Catholic, whether you're an evangelical, you believe that there is a melody in the universe. You believe there's a God who's communicating. It's not a disenchanted, it's enchanted. There's something we're meant to be in contact with. I think the question is, how do we best come in contact with God? I think, in the Roman Catholic, there's a reliance more upon the form of the liturgy, as it's called, the worship service. Multi-sensory, there's incense, there's vestments, or there's different robes. Sometimes there's things said in other languages. And all of that does have a sense of enchantment. If you're an evangelical, you really believe that it's through the Word of God. That as you go through history, you find that God has always chosen not so much the eyes, but the ears to teach us. And we've got this accumulated wisdom, that goes all the way back to the early Israelites, through Jesus, the apostles. And so we have these books in the Bible, and we hold these as you could call the oracles of God, that God still speaks through these. And so if you step inside an evangelical church, the things that you're really going to be confronted with where God is chanting, so to speak, there's a priority of understanding the Bible and understanding its relevance. There's a real emphasis on the cross itself, that something happens in Jesus's death and resurrection that make that the centerpiece of all of history. And I think you also find a real emphasis just on personal holiness, but not holiness that keeps you just kind of living good for yourself, but a holiness that you want to see actually bring transformation in the world. And so you want to see your faith begin to make a difference in the lives of people around you.
So does that mean that you're encouraged in evangelical church to study the Bible on your own accord as well?
Yeah, I think I think we need to, yes and no. So certainly yes. I think, evangelicals, you often find, they like to read their Bible. They may do Bible studies, that kind of thing. I think where you have to be a little bit careful is there's something about the modern person that's anti-authoritarian. And there's a kind of arrogance often that, give me my Bible and myself, and I should be able to understand all that's true. Now that's a naive perspective. Scientists don't operate that way. Nobody begins a new chemistry experiment by ignoring all the wisdom of past scientists. And so there are authoritative voices that help. What question should I be asking? What's the accumulated wisdom? And so I think my emphasis is always to tell people, I want you to be reading with other people from the past, because I think that's going to protect you from just getting from the text what you want to get from it. So yes, we read the Bible, but I think we want to think deeply about how to read it well. And so you're not just left with your own interpretation.
So does that mean you would, for example, in Aaron's case, he might study the Bible on the daily basis on his own, and then is that in line with some group study, or do you guys hold like a discussion every week to, how do you support that kind of, because he's certainly powering through it in a sense, like he's studying.
Yeah, well, we do believe that there's an old word, perspicuity, that isn't used, but it means a kind of clarity. And so, I would challenge anybody, read the Bible. It has transformed people's lives through all of history. If you're intimidated by the whole of the Bible, take a single letter. Probably the greatest letter from the Roman world is a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to the Romans. It won't take you more than an hour or two to read. But this is a letter that famously Augustine, one of the great minds of the ancient world, his life is transformed. You can read in the Confessions when he just reads Romans. You can fast forward, the whole of the Reformation happens because Luther is thinking about Romans. Later on, John Wesley, all of the sort of social reforms that he was behind, it began, he's reading Romans. So, there's just small bits that you can read that have consistently changed people's lives. And so that's a great place for people to start. But yeah, someone like Aaron is a great example of, he's reading on his own. we're meeting together. I think faith should always have friendship. There should always be this sense of doing it with people, with a community. And so, you can have a community, you can have reading with a friend, and you can also be reading on your own, and all of that weaves together wonderfully.
And in terms of the, because you were brought up evangelical, right?
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about that marriage component, because for me it really seems like an important aspect that, this is just my arrogance, ignorance against the church that has been with us, the Roman Catholic Church, for quite a few hundreds of years. But it seems to me that it is very... it seems to me like the wrong choice to keep celibacy a part of your doctrine. And, there are different versions of why celibacy came into the Roman Catholic Church. One version is that it was about keeping the church land within the church, simply because otherwise the son of the priest might not choose to become a priest, and therefore that land might become obsolete. Of course, there was another idea, that there's another theory that it was due to the unholiness of the practices throughout the 14th, 15th century, and then the sort of crackdown on it to reassert the idea that we are holy, therefore we are unsoiled. Mm-hmm. From my perspective, it played a huge role, and it seems to be playing a huge role, especially if we are, in a society such as Poland. The Polish society right now is doing a lot to empower families, right? There are some reforms being made and already in place to empower people to have more kids, simply because we don't have enough kids. Yeah. We don't have enough families, and our world as we know it is crumbling. And I don't think there is any country in Europe right now that has a replacement rate. Yeah. And so, this might be quite a shocking thing to offer to the Polish church, but I would argue cut down celibacy and focus on revitalizing that family spirit, that family idea. And maybe other people, such as myself, would not be so discouraged by the irony of someone without a family telling me how to lead one.
Yeah, I think what's ironic is that probably the best social teaching of the last several generations has come out of the Roman Catholic Church. And so I think if you were to look at someone like Pope John Paul II, his teaching on the family is actually, it's the sort of antidote to all the problems of the modern world. And, the sort of standard Catholic answer that he would have given would have been, don't just have kids, but have at least three. If you have one, you have this sort of idol at the center of your home that all of the attention of two people focuses on. That's not healthy. You have two, that's good, but we all know that two is not really a community. When you have three, you've got these multiple relationships, even between the siblings themselves, and you begin to have a real community in the home. And so I think the strange thing about the Catholic Church, and I can say this not being a part of it, is on the one side you have this robust teaching on family, on marriage. They've got very definite views on sexuality that are conservative in light of all of the progressive movements. But then on the other side, you have this medieval hangover of the celibate clergy that I would agree with you. I think it hinders some of your own experience. So for example, I would struggle to preach, I'd struggle to be a pastor without knowing what it's like to be married, to have children myself. I mean, the kind of humility you gain as you struggle through parenting, but equally to have that voice. My best friend is my wife, and we've shared life like none of my other friends and I have, and so she constantly is able to be a trusted feedback or encourager. Times that I'd probably fall into despair or depression or whatever, she's able to lift me out. Or if I'm going to do something that honestly is stupid, she can say, no, that's a bad idea. So I think there's multiple pragmatic reasons that I wish that the Catholic Church would reconsider their position.
Yeah, it seems to me, especially in that social sense, that if we are acting to one another as mirrors, right? Yeah. You need other people to not go insane.
Yeah.
It's proven. You will at some point, because you don't have someone to sort of push against you every now and then, right? Like, check yourself.
Absolutely.
If you keep having the same problem with different people, you're the problem. You know what I mean? Like, you need that feedback. And it's not obvious to me that even a congregation of maybe a monastery or, you know, a group of students of faith coming together can give you that, simply because there is no the level of intimacy is not met. And I don't think you can have the same level of intimacy with a friend as you will have with your spouse. By definition, it seems to me that there are certain places where a non-intimate relationship will simply not delve. And then, as you said, I would agree that it almost seems like your experience as a human being is not complete. And therefore, it's unlikely that you will be able to help, or you might just be slightly less available to help in some areas, simply because you don't know. You know, it's like if you've never drunk alcohol, advising someone on how it is to drink alcohol can be quite a challenge. Of course, you can do it. You can simply say not to do it.
Yeah.
But you know, as an experience-based idea of any kind, not doing it probably hinders your ability to help.
And some of the earliest things we read in the Bible, and we're talking about the first pages, are it's not good for man to be alone. That we're this relational creature, and this sense that, you know, as you read the first chapter of Genesis, everything's good, and then Adam is made, and it's not good for him to be alone. And then, you know, from himself comes Eve, and there's this sense of fulfillment. And then they're both told, be fruitful and multiply. This sense that, again, it's not just about the two of you, but, you know, part of that, the mission of humanity is to raise up that next generation. And so I think this is the sort of basic calling of humankind. And again, so those who are meant to give spiritual guidance to other human beings should be invested in that fundamental calling themselves.
Yeah, and before we go into the book, because I'd like to read a few sort of notes from it and ask some questions, just to finish this off, I just thought about the idea that, you know, we seem to not be having that many kids, we seem to not be having that many marriages. And the one overarching theme, which I've heard even from my siblings over the past, let's say, 5 years or so, that I've been struggling against these ideas, is that lack of hope, right? You said earlier about the promise of a better future. It is very difficult for people, I think, nowadays, if they do feel that the world is going in the wrong direction, to to make a case for bringing children into the world. And this is a difficult this is difficult for me to counter. You know what I mean? I'm an optimist by heart, and personally I do believe that while the world is going through a tumultuous time, as it usually does on the fourth turning of any cycle, I do believe that there is a lot of light at the end of this tunnel, and that I have no doubt that my children will be better off being than not, simply by the feature of being. Yeah. But it is not obvious for me that people who do not believe in a greater thing will think so, and maybe that's where revival of faith will play a part in revival of hope.
I hope so, but regardless, I would tell people, do you want to make a difference? I think most people say yes. What's the biggest difference you could make? What's the greatest need of our planet? It's not another nonprofit. It's not another corporation. It's great human beings. We need more good human beings that care about virtue and society and politics. So the greatest thing you can do to benefit the future, raise a child, invest in them, teach them. There's a picture in the Bible, in the Psalms, about a man whose quiver is full of arrows. It's a picture of children. And the reason children are pictured as arrows is because when you shoot an arrow, it goes further than you are. Our lives are going to be done soon. Who's going to take up the flag next and carry it forward? It's the next generation. Well, don't you want to be invested in raising the next generation? So, I mean, we get so invested in our career, or we get so invested, in some kind of social cause, that's going to end very quickly. If you can raise kids that raise good grandchildren, if you can actually, contribute multi-generations of people with wisdom and character, that's what the world needs. And so, if people really care and feel like things are in a bad state, they should be getting married, and they need to be having more kids, and they need to be investing more in those children.
I love that, and then I would just follow up with this. Why do you think people should get married? I think this is really important for my listeners to hear. Yeah,
I think there's this way we want to anchor love in ourselves. So I mean, there's two ways we go about this. We could talk about the theological purpose of marriage, but not all the listeners are going to be people of faith. So let's come at it from a different angle. We often think, well, I love this person, they love me. Isn't that enough? Anybody who's actually been married knows that the experience of the ceremony and of the taking of vows is transformative. You come out the other side and you've got a commitment that's not just anchored inside of you. It's anchored outside of you. That's why in the past, people, they did take vows, they did take oaths. And when you stand up in front of a congregation of people and someone like a minister, and you pledge for better and worse in sickness and health, I'm going to love you. Now, all of that means that in those moments later on, and every marriage has them, where things get a little bit rocky, it's so helpful to have that in the background so that you have something that holds you fast, because marriages get stronger by going through those hard things. And often people who are unmarried, when they get to those patches, they give up. And so because of how feeble human love is, we need these social practices, we need these rituals, we need these promises to create what the Bible calls a covenant, where two people pledge themselves in fidelity for better or worse. And that's what kids need too. Kids need to look up and have confidence that mom and dad are going to be together for a long time. And marriage is one of those ways that we give confidence to our kids that we're committed to this, which means we're committed to you.
It's almost like reframing the marriage of two people as a security bond, rather than a rock and a rope around your neck, right? Which I unfortunately I believe the media of our time tend to present almost as if like a burden,
And that's what the thing it angers me when I hear someone talk about marriage as settling down. It's not settling down, it's the great adventure. I hate when people live together for 10 years and then get married like it's a finish line. It's the starting line. It's doing something that it takes a lot of guts and a lot of trust, saying I'm gonna jump in and we're gonna go the distance together. And then you throw kids in and everything else, and it's like a raft trip. You're going down the rapids and there's all kinds of things around you, but it's an adventure. It's not at all settling down.
Yeah, I resonate with that. It's interesting how language in general, how words shape our reality, like what we decide to focus on, to elaborate, expands, and settling down. The frame of it, that it's pointing downwards, as if it's either stationary or worse yet, it's a downward, like it's only gonna get worse from here. And this is, we're maybe spending slightly too much time on this, but this is you just made me think. We've had an interaction like that with one of our further family members, right about the time that we were getting married with my wife, when this old lady who's been married for 50 years, they have kids, they're probably gonna have grandkids, she comes up to us and she says this, oh, it's gonna be, they say it's not only gonna be roses, it's gonna be really hard. And she leaves us with this message of kind of despair. it's interesting why, and for me it's quite obvious that people have aversion to negativity more than optimism, and over the course of our lives we are challenged and potentially can become bitter if we don't hold fast to some sort of personal story or a faith of somewhat. But even though that person is religious, yet this is the kind of spell that they offer us in this special day. Why that happens, I'm not so sure, but it seems like even those that are participating in the wonder of marriage can still be the proponents of just how unlucky this whole thing is.
And I would just as a counter voice for those that have heard that sort of thing in a testimony, again, I'm 21 years in, and in every sense, the relationship is better than 20 years ago. That's the notion. I mean, relationships are like a stream of water that, as it flows over time, can get deeper and deeper to where it becomes a big river. And your capacity to love someone, it's able to increase over time. Sure, that takes effort. It takes intentionality. You have to continue to know that person and not reduce them to what you think you know, because they're changing. But if that happens, then that channel of love can grow more and more forceful to where, a couple that's been married for 35 years, they know something about loving that someone 30 years the other direction can't even fathom. So the capacity, we need more stories of the richness, the blessing, the goodness of marriage, and sadly we don't have many in our culture right now.
I think we're getting there. I feel this revival, and also there are trends among the Gen Z, for example, that not only they decide not to take part in like some drugs, alcohol, things that for my generation or when I was growing up, it was all about like, as soon as possible let's drink alcohol, as soon as possible let's smoke cigarettes, because that's what adults do, that's what you're supposed to do. Whereas my brother, who's only 9 years minor from me, his experience was he only started drinking small doses of alcohol by the time he turned like 19 on some graduation parties, and the way that he perceives it versus the way that I pursued it is a complete distortion. So even on the 10-year period, you can find that the wave is already among his friends, many are not drinking. Among my friends, many are. It's like there's 2 of us in a group of 7 that is abstinent, the other 5 are still drinking, versus at my brother's situation, there's 5 of them that don't drink and 2 that drink occasionally. It is very, very interesting how those, and I am hopeful about the marriage, at least in Poland. And
we need hope. We need more people with hope.
So I'd like to ask you 3 different topics. We maybe go through 3 different topics, and the first one we sort of alluded to, about the need for religion, why there seems to be a need, and in your book, The Road Back to God, you write this paragraph: "It's not just that doubts and questions need to be overcome, apathy and indifference also need to be overcome. It's not just that truth needs to be understood. In some cases, truth also needs to be felt. It's not just that man need to figure out what they believe. A lot of men need first to be prompted to think. All of this means that the journey to faith starts much further back than might be expected. We can't get to the foothills of religion until we first find a way out of the spiritual malaise that is endemic among men raised in the backwater of therapeutic consumerism." What I've taken from that, and as I was contemplating how to structure the question around it, I've come to a thought that really bothers me around our day and age anyway, which is, I think for the most part, people are not really willing to question and willing to look for answers that are longer than 4 seconds videos on TikTok.
Yep.
This video is going to be an hour, hour and a half. That's probably a cutoff point for many, and many more would have not even considered watching it, simply because they consume, which you reflect on, therapeutic consumerism. They consume in very short bursts, as simple as possible. Usually that means as superficial as possible. And so the way I understand your beginning of the book is you try to first point out just how ignorant and how maybe uncurious we are to begin with. And so asking about faith while you're not even curious about yourself is a bit of a too big of a hill to climb to begin with, right? Yeah. How do you start a conversation with someone? Let's say that you encounter someone who seems to be really lost in their life. They don't know what they're looking for. They might not know that they're looking for a faith or a religious revival. How do you start that conversation? Where would you begin?
I don't know why, but I think the assumption of most people is that if there's a God, it should be the most obvious fact in the world, or it should be the most accessible experience of the world, such that, if you think of the level of engagement of your typical man, we've been talking about men, it's probably either been he's had a few conversations in pubs, like casual conversations, and at some point never really made a decision one way or another, but he's just following his gut. Or maybe he's watched some lectures on like YouTube, or he's watched some short videos. So in other words, he spent like a sum total of like a few hours in his life investigating what all of the great voices from the past, from all the religions and philosophies, would say is the most profound thing there, question you can ask. This is the big quest of life, and we just think we should be able to consume information and just immediately discern if it's true or not. I take the Bible and I take Jesus serious when he says, "Seek and you will find." But I think we have to be attentive. I think there are certain things that if you follow them might lead you interesting directions. So for example, your own conscience. And the kind of path that if you follow good, what begins to happen in your soul, a kind of freedom, or if you follow evil. If you really pay attention to the consequences, you begin to realize there's a moral dynamic in our universe that's very real. Or I think, just your own longings, your own deep satisfactions, what you're not satisfied. I mean, how often do we ignore the fact that we're not satisfied by our consumeristic environment, which is why we constantly have to overload ourselves. Why is it that we can't be silent by ourselves and be at peace with ourselves? Maybe there's something unsettling that if you did allow yourself to be alone by yourself, that you would begin to encounter aspects of reality that you'll never find on the television or on your phone. So I would begin to encourage people to not put this at the bottom of their list of to-dos, investigate God. Let's be honest, the bottom of the bucket list of life. If there's a God, if there's such a thing as real fulfillment of our soul, this is the top of the list. And so it's more important than making money. It's more important than success in your career. It's more important than, whether casual sex or just, whatever your base, pleasure is. This is the thing on which hope and fulfillment and happiness and joy and everything else depends. And so put it at the top and treat it like a serious quest. I think that's a great word. If you take the word question, it goes embedded in it is that sense of a quest. So begin to ask hard questions. Begin to read things that challenge your assumptions on the world. Engage in real conversations. Maybe even engage in spiritual practices. Have you ever been to a worship service? Have you ever actually spent time praying? Have you been up to the top of a mountain, when the stars are out? Do the sort of things that consistently put you, or people have said, put them in touch with transcendence. And then see if there's not beginning to be a path that begins to unfold, or a deepening of your experiences. But that's what I think. Treat it like it's serious enough that your soul depends upon it.
I love it, and you just made me think and unpack the idea also that, you know, it is probably not a coincidence that the time since religion and institution and faith diminished, it correlates with the time where technology such as screens, TV screens, entered the living rooms. Yeah. If you think about it, TV screens nowadays are in place of the fireplace.
Yeah.
What you would do back in the day was maybe read a book, maybe write something, maybe discuss.
Yeah.
But most importantly, engage with the fire, which in and of itself is quite a, I would argue, quite a transcendental thing to experience. What you see, if you take a closer look at the fire, is literally the transformation of matter into other you know, physical form, and the energy being expanded as part of it there and then. I used to laugh with my wife whenever we would have a bonfire at our summer house, that this is witnessing the present moment the most particularly. I don't know if you can find, or at least I've not found in my life, any external phenomena that allows me to be so in touch with the present as the fire burning. So this might be the case as well, that simply because we've put in a place of something that is alive and here and now, something out there, we simply allowed ourselves over the course of our generations to be so much not in touch with ourselves that we cannot sit still. And this is a huge problem, right?
I think it is. I mean, there's a wonderful, in the Bible, in the Psalms, the psalmist says, the heavens declare the glory of God. So this sense of, there's something about the beauty of the natural order that, you know, carries forward a sense of transcendence. And I think that's one of the things that can open up modern souls. I think, you know, there have been people that have sort of discredited a sense of goodness. There's no such thing as morality. There have been people that have discredited a sense of truth. But the one thing that still remains, and this is of the three transcendentals, as Aristotle would call them, but is beauty. You know, that there's beauty, and when you come in contact with beauty, it does something. It sort of awakens. This is what Plato would call the sort of eros that awakens and sort of moves the soul toward transcendence. And we all know it. I mean, if you have that moment in Scotland, we've got beautiful skies where you look up, maybe you're walking your dog, and all of a sudden the sun is setting. And you know, the trees can't see it, and there's birds flying, they can't see it, but for some reason human beings have been given the capacity not just to feed ourselves, not just to have propagate our species. For whatever reason, we have this ability to appreciate beauty. And it makes you want to worship. You know, you may not know who to worship, but you know, there's something about it that feels very spiritual. And it's the same sort of thing, like you said. I mean, whether it's a fire, whether it's a waterfall, these things that even just a strong wind that just awakens something. And so if we pay attention, it's not that those things are going to tell us the name of God is Jesus, but they're going to feed that quest. And maybe there's more trying to communicate with us than we realize. That's part of what I think, you know, these traditions, and I certainly think Christianity, I believe that God so wants to communicate that the Bible calls Jesus the Word. The Word took flesh, that God actually stepped into our world as a human being. I mean, whatever you believe, that's an interesting idea. I mean, have you never taken time to think why 1 billion people on the planet think that of all things God took the form and didn't go to experience pleasure, but to go die a death of public execution? I mean, you should at least ask your Christian friends, what do you believe? Why do you believe this? How does this make sense to you? It's really, really fascinating and deserves at some point, you know, sustained thought.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask you this maybe because I've had I've recently had a conversation on the podcast with a few weeks ago with one of my friends from jiu-jitsu, who essentially, when we were I was trying to elicit a response whether or not what does he believe to be the case in terms of spiritual, and he just simply said he doesn't believe anything other than we're a flesh, there is a brain, the brain has chemical reactions, and we're basically like a walking meat suit, walking, thinking meat suit, and all of that is simply that. There is no soul, no, no spirituality, no nothing else other than that what meets the eye, whether you dissect it or not. And as much as I would like to have a discussion with him and point him in, how he can observe that that's not the case, I was lost for words, because I know that my experience and what I've experienced to be here might simply be not something that he will. What you would encourage a person like himself to do? Is there any particular activity that you would point them that would at least elicit them to think again about this concept?
Yeah, to think that that we're more than just that sort of matter. Someone like that first needs to realize the only reason he believes that is because he's listened to certain voices. He has trusted voices that he's listened to that have convinced him of that. In other words, he's built it on faith. He's trusted the reports of other people. Maybe they were called scientists, but he's trusting them. Well, there's lots of other voices that have experienced things. I would first of all just say, listen to the billions of people that are talking about experiences that go beyond. I would also just encourage them, again, to realize that we live in such an amazing universe. And I think if anything, in the last 100 years, science has opened that up to us with mystery that previously, there was kind of an age where we thought we were going to be able to get by without mystery, and then all of a sudden everything changed. And increasingly, it seems unlikely that we can come in contact with everything that is with these finite bodies that we have. And so the idea, at least in my mind, that something like prayer could actually be useful to come in contact. I mean, the Christian notion of the universe is that as we think of God, and you always have to take your conception of God and realize you probably have a childish one and have to rethink it. But as we think about eternal power, it's the most personal of all existence. And I know people think it's a strange belief, but this idea of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, part of what that reveals is the idea that eternity is a communication or a community of persons. There's love. And so to come in contact with reality at the deepest level will never be found through a microscope. It will never be found through a telescope. It's going to take personal engagement. Now, how do I know you? I didn't know you an hour ago. I had to trust that, first of all, that you would treat me well, and there's a degree of trust, and I had to talk to you, and you've had to talk to me, and as we've had this conversation, I'm finding out about you, and we're starting to build a relationship. What if God's like that? What if it actually takes him disclosing his own reality to us responding, and over time they're building a kind of trusting relationship? Now, if from the outset I decide I'm not going to trust you, and I close myself off to you, I'm never going to get to know you. And if that's your mentality, if you're just going to say, I live in a materialistic universe, there's no such thing, I'm not even interested, well, don't be surprised if you end up feeling like you live in an isolated, materialistic universe. Because it may only be by opening yourself up that you begin to experience what people have talked about as a relationship with God.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, funnily enough, ironically enough, what brought me back to God, in a sense of believing that there is an eternal power greater than myself that is there, is recognizing within the meditation of simply contemplating one's thoughts that there is someone else thinking, and this is the experience which I think many of us is consciously or subconsciously stopping ourselves from experiencing, simply because we're so overstimulated, right? And it is very difficult to notice that your thoughts are not yours if you never actually for a moment think, what are you thinking? You know what I mean? Like thoughts pop into my head, and whether you want to say that they are mine or not, it's irrelevant. But I am an observer of these thoughts when I do have them. It's not that they have me. And what you said about prayer, that's how I understand contemplating the reality with which I come into engagement. And I would definitely like add on top of that, as you said about opening yourself to the reality of God, let's say, that not only when you open yourself to it you can start to witness it, but as well I believe that as you open yourself to it and start interacting with it, you're actually more in charge of creating that reality, which is the paradox that a limited perception of there is only limited physical universe, you're creating that for yourself because you've closed all the windows and doors for everything else, and this is your world. The moment you start opening those windows, not only do you see more of the world, but you also have more paths to follow, essentially, to interact with. That's really beautiful, and I wanted to talk with you about the idea of sin, because and you said in one of your previous interviews of sin in the context of Jordan Peterson, funnily enough, about missing the aim, missing the mark. I must say, Jordan Peterson's work, especially his lectures and his books, and I did read them all, played a huge role in my sort of revival of understanding. I first read 12 Rules for Life, which was very useful in kind of like getting my stuff together. But then Maps of Meaning, which were... have you had a chance to...
Yeah, I've not read Maps of Meaning, but I've read his others.
Yeah, so Maps of Meaning, in a nutshell, is a sort of linguistic, psychological analysis of what, throughout the Bible and the other pieces of, historical religious rites, he basically tries to, through the perspective of linguistic psychology, tries to make the sense of that myth, which the Bible offers, and maybe put it in the perspective of how does that potentially, it's a bit more academic, I guess, than what you need on a day-to-day. But it certainly, for me, it was a challenge that I've wanted to take up, and it played a huge role in me appreciating the Bible more, for its many many parts. And it seems to me, it resonates with me, that to sin, the way I perceive it, is to do that which is wrong. And whether that is morally wrong, whether that is spiritually wrong, whether that is wrong for my body, simply like physically, if I drink a pint of bleach, that's a sin to my body that I am doing so. It's simply not the right thing to do. What would you add to that perspective of what sin is, and why do you think it's so important? And I do believe it is, for our day and age to maybe contemplate sin as a phenomenon.
Yeah, I think you can have kind of an existential level, and you can think of a sort of theological level. At an existential level, if you look at different things that are living but don't have the ability to choose or to will. So again, we'll go back to your plant right here, your lovely plant. You've planted it in soil, and you probably water it. It's not able to lift itself out of its pot and go put itself in the middle of the floor where it will shrivel up. If it's in good conditions, it stays in those conditions and is cared for. The burden of free will is that we have choice, and we are the creature that can go against our nature, which means we can live self-destructively. And at an existential level, people need to realize that sin, it's not like a bad parent arbitrarily setting up a bunch of rules because he or she is a killjoy and doesn't want someone to have fun. that the kind of wisdom that directs us toward righteousness is equally directing us toward fulfillment. And the problem with sin, it's a bit like a drug. I mean, there's a short-term pleasure, but a long-term misery. And so from this existential level, people need to realize that if they give themselves to, call them vices, call them trespasses in the old sense, call them sins, Paul the Apostle says the wages of sin are death. And part of what he means, that means multiple things, but one thing is that you're actually going to earn death for yourself. You will find your soul shriveling up as you give yourself to gluttony or slothfulness, envy or greed or anger or lust. But there's also, I think, a theological level. I think, as soon as you accept the fact that there's a God who's righteous, well, then there's also a degree of accountability. And so the Bible also speaks of sin in that term of accountability, such that you can live as if you are an independent creature. If in fact you owe allegiance to the one who made you, there might be consequences for that behavior that are worth thinking about. So I think we can think about sin on multiple levels.
That's interesting. You said about the difference. All of these things pointing essentially downward, right? Like you're acting against yourself when you sin, in whatever shape. And yet again, something that popped up to me straight away in my subconscious mind, let's say, is yet again, the moment we are not hopeful for the future, the moment we are not thinking that long-term plans are worth our while, even if it's subconscious, that's the moment when all this potentially sinful behavior, potentially short-term pleasure seeking, it becomes attractive. It's this time preference, on a more simple level. It's simply whether I believe my future is better than today. If my today is better than my future, then I am more inclined to do things today that I simply want, and that's it, rather than think about long-term consequences. And I must ask you this, and I don't know if I'm correct, but I heard on one of your shows that you do CrossFit training.
Yeah.
Is that CrossFit you like?
So I've done less over here. I've been a kind of a garage gym junkie here, but so I've done some of that, and I do enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, because I wanted to point out that for both me, Aaron, and quite frankly, I would say many of people that I admire and notice successing in life have at least employed some degree of long-term seeking behavior, whether it's consistency, self-discipline, compound interest effect of your habits, all of these things. And it is quite obvious to me at this point that if I were to change one thing about people around me that are struggling in life, is to refocus them on that long-term thinking. Because the moment you think about long-term, whether it's because you want to have kids, whether it's because you want to have a family, whether it's because you want to live till 80 and not die by the age of 50, it seems to me that discussing sin becomes much easier, because it's much easier to put it in a frame of that which will make you better long-term on a deeper level versus that which will make you good here. Is that something that you resonate with?
Yeah, no, I think there is that sense that goodness and happiness, they do weave together, not perfectly, because we know there's all kinds of suffering that can result, but that, your fulfillment depends upon the pursuit of the good. Equally, the pursuit of the evil will be self-destructive. I think that the radical thing, though, of the New Testament and of the whole of the Bible really is the idea that human beings have this self-destructive tendency. That we can want, the thing I want to do, Paul says, I don't do. The thing I don't want to do, I do. And I think we have to really wrestle and do justice with that, because it's the point at which self-mastery becomes insufficient. That we can try our hardest, and we should, in a real sense, seek that self-discipline. But if you pay attention, you'll find one of two things. Either your good intentions they're derailed by yourself. There's something broken within us that we have to think about. The other is the danger that actually you become really self-disciplined, but you become proud simultaneously. And that's always been viewed as the chief sin. And so this whole idea of the pursuit of the good is actually much more complicated, much more interesting. We're entangled in it much more than we realize, which again is a reason we should be having these conversations, and men should be thinking. You say the word sin, it sounds very old-fashioned. It sounds like it has no relevance in the modern world. Actually, you take it out of our self-understanding, and you're not really given a term or a concept that does justice to the inner upheaval that we experience as we keep bumping up against the same problem. We think you pull up one weed and then something else, grows in your life elsewhere. And why is this attempt to grow into better creatures so difficult? Again, the Bible's got this concept, sin, that we really need to think about.
Yeah, you just made me think. I don't see another word to put in place of sin, in a sense. Like you can say it's a fail, or it's a failure, or it's missing the point, but that's just downplaying.
Yeah.
But I understand as well. I agree that for some people, especially those that are not familiar and observe sin as simply something that was used before in the Bible, maybe it can be slightly old-fashioned to begin with. So navigating that is definitely a challenge. Now, before I ask my final question of the podcast, as per usual, you just made me think about, in my experience, whenever I act righteously, in a sense that on a deeper level, I believe that to be right. I observe that the world, the universe, God, whatever you want to call it, supports my activity. It's sometimes as simple as, if I'm planning a trip that is not supposed to happen, there will be many things popping up again and again to almost like stop me and rethink whether or not I should do it. Versus if I take on an endeavor that I believe is supposed to happen, it goes so smoothly that it just so happens. And I think a great example for my life was meeting my wife. This is not to say that we have had no problems in our relationship, everyone does, but trying to explain to my friend recently how it is when you find the right person, I'm lost for words. It simply is, you just, I believe it was meant to be, and therefore everything happened the way it was supposed to happen, and here we are, and it will happen the way it's supposed to happen. What's your experience with that, and how would you maybe, because I felt from your answer about sinning and finding the good, that there are sort of maybe moments when, if you do reflect, you can see that the path is open. What's the kind of experience for yourself like that?
Yeah, I think there is a dynamic, is maybe the best word, that we can be attuned toward, that I would say God wants to be involved in our lives. We may not always realize when He is. I would also say, though, that there's something in this world, though, that is set up that's antagonistic to righteousness and God. And the great challenge of the life of Jesus, for example, is He is presented in the Bible is starkly honest about the faults of its characters. So the interesting thing about the Bible is it never paints its chief figures in holy lights. They all have a tragic flaw. Then you come to Jesus, and there is none. This is the man who, if you want to know what moral truth looks like, he's the four-dimensional, kind of embodiment of it. And what happens to him? He gets nailed to a piece of wood and left out to die. And so here's the best human that has walked our planet, and he's rejected. And it's a rejection of the religious, it's a rejection of the political power. It's almost like the collective representatives of humanity decide, we don't like this, it's too good, and discard it. And so I would say there's equally this dynamic where if you're really insistent upon the pursuit of truth and righteousness, you also often then find that you go against the grain of something. And I think, you read the great lives of people who have taken hard stands or chosen to really stand for truth, and they stand out. They're eccentric. They're sometimes persecuted, and sometimes they're even scapegoated. And so, I wouldn't say there's both. There is a sense that I think, especially as you open yourself up to God, that you have a sense of Him moving with you. You'll also, though, often find, as Jesus says, you'll take up a cross, and you'll end up going against the direction of the world, and that's hard sometimes.
Yeah, I do believe it's more difficult in the short term, right? Yeah. Yet again, we come back to this dynamic long-term, short-term, that in the short term, it will be more difficult to do that which you do not want to do,
yeah.
right? And not only the Bible, but many myths about all kinds of, stories from the past point to this idea that the treasure is to be found there where you least want to look, right? Yeah. It's as if, maybe the fact that it's so consistent across different traditions, maybe you should pay attention to it.
Yeah, when people want to go find meaning or purpose or direction or God, they go to the wilderness. It's the last place that you go for bodily comfort,
Yeah.
So
and dopamine seeking activity.
There's none of that, and yet that's the space you come out of transformed. So.
Yeah. Now, Joe, always, and this is regardless of what my speaker will talk about or what is the topic of the episode overall, I always invite my guests to leave like a final, maybe something that resonates with you, maybe a book, a resource to look forward, to look into, a message that you'd like to share to our audience as we wrap up the episode, anything that was left unsaid and you feel like it should be there still.
Trying to think what we've talked about and what might be useful, and maybe a book. C.S. Lewis is such a wonderful guide, and people know that name, but he has an account of his own journey toward faith called Surprised by Joy. And I think in Surprised by Joy, there's a concept he develops called joy, but it's a kind of longing. And it's an interesting concept in that he describes the way in which we often find ourselves satisfied and yet dissatisfied at the same time. We find ourselves longing for something that keeps kind of eluding or escaping us. Most creatures, if you are a fish, everything you need is just in the water around you. We're that creature that we can be given food, we can be given shelter, we can be given community, and they're still longing. And I think, again, people pay attention to that. I'm not going to take your journey for you, but I think if that longing, if you're attuned to it, it'll pull you out of materialism, out of a consumptive lifestyle. It'll lead you into thinking, reading books, having better conversations with your friends, and it just might lead you to God Himself too. So that'd be my thought.
Yeah, that's wonderful. It's and it's resonant to what we discussed, right? Like you have to start by being willing to question what life is about, willing to have those difficult conversations. And I hope that for people, whether joining a church or whether joining just a group of like-minded individuals, even the fact that I'm talking with you right now, this is because Aaron felt so resonant with what you're offering at the church, and he felt the resonance with me that he wanted to share that. He gave me the book, he wanted to share this experience, and I guess this is also why you should get out there and switch off your phone, unless you form a strong enough relationship to be able to talk about these difficult topics, because it's not easy to start talking to a friend about religion. No one likes to talk about religion to begin with. It's like like politics. It's almost like a taboo, you know, same as money. I think those three topics seem to be like people shrivel, and they don't want to even start to discuss it, maybe because there is some sort of stigma or whatever trauma, but yeah, I hope that for all of our listeners that this was something that was worth their while. It certainly was for me. Thank you so much for coming to the show, and I'll make sure to do a separate episode on this book, and I'll see about the other ones. Thank you so much, Joe, for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening, guys.